on this computer.
Yep, there you go.
Okay. All right. Louis, come on. Where's the recent? Let's see.
Very nice having that.
Did you have it on?
Let's go to recent. There we go.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
All right. All right, you want to get this feel? Then we can shut the door.
And I'll shut the door.
All right, hey everyone. Brandon won't be in today. Instead, he has me, Xavier, one of his grad students, giving a presentation. Hello to everyone I know. And Henry will follow suit.
Hello, I'm also one of Brandon's grad students. Hello if you know me, hello if you don't.
So again, I'm Xavier. I'm a PhD student, well, PhD candidate now. My third year. I study reptile evolution, usually mostly reptiles in the Permian, so around 300 million to 250 million years ago. And today I'm going to give you guys a little short, hopefully simple spiel on the evolution of mostly hearing and tetrapods. If I was to do this adequately, I'd probably need 4 lectures, but I'm going to try to get this as condensed as possible. I'm not sure whether or not Brandon will be asking you guys any questions on what we're teaching you. Yeah, mine should be fairly simple. So I hope to go for like 20-30 minutes max, and then you guys can ask me questions. But mostly I'm just going to be yelling information at you guys. And hopefully you guys take 20% of it. So yeah, let's get started on sensory evolution in tetrapods. And I actually haven't tested my animations yet. So Savannah was actually there an hour ago when I was doing this PowerPoint for you guys. So let's get started. So what are tetrapods? Hopefully by this point in your comparative anatomy class, you know what a tetrapod is. Tetrapods include amphibians, including frogs, caecilians, and salamanders, as well as the amniotes, or reptiles and mammals, seen here. Anywhere from a crocodile to Nicolas Cage is an amniote. And the evolution of tetrapods, specifically tetrapodomorphs, is particularly well studied, especially the so-called fin to limb transition. This is essentially the evolution of a fish-like body plan from a lobe-finned fish ancestor to something that has 4 limbs and can walk on land. And I'll get that. Oh, come in. And in part because there are living representatives of Sarcopterygians, or fish that have 4 lobed fins, like lungfish here, as well as an abundance of a fossil record from a lot of transitional taxa. And I just showed you guys some paleo art here of the so-called fin to limb transition. And there are quite a bit of fossils in the Carboniferous and Devonian documenting this. And as you may have realized, compared to a fish, tetrapods have a heavily modified body plan. It's mostly around the fact that they have limbs and they can walk instead of, swimming. A lot of these adaptations, let's get that out of the way. They include the development of like weight-bearing wrists, ankles, and elbows. So if you don't know, fish don't really have elbows, and they don't have wrists either. Also the adaptations of hip joints. You need a hip, aka your hip bones need to be connected to your spinal column in order to walk around. They need to bear weight, otherwise you just slide to the ground. As well as the reduction of the hand and foot from a sort of ray-finned type fish morphology to 5 digits. Your favorite 5 fingers today. Let's see. I'm gonna hide you or whatever. So tetrapods, like these 4 fossils here, are tetrapodomorphs. They evolve adaptations for locomotion, or simply limbs, far before they at least evolve observable adaptations to sensory innovations on land. That is, hearing on land is going to be a lot more difficult, a lot different than hearing or seeing in the water. In part, when you hear in water, so fish that hear in water, sound vibrations are moving water that are hitting your inner ear. Your inner ear system is liquid. So terrestrial animals need to be able to hear via airwaves that are hitting and displacing their inner ear liquid. That's called impedance matching hearing. And essentially, a lot more energy is needed to convert airborne sound waves to displace the inner ear liquid in your ear than simply water hitting water and you interpreting sound waves that way. Also, you might know terrestrial vision requires intense adaptations relative to seeing underwater, including stuff like external eyelids and the ability to move your eyeballs around. You might notice fish tend to not do that. And that has to do with the development of several muscles. But before I even talk about tetrapod hearing, I'm going to talk about hearing from our perspective. Have you guys gone over any sort of hearing anatomy in any of these bio courses here, or heard of anatomy? All right, so maybe a little bit. So I'm just going to go over this very simply. But the crux of it is your ear is divided into three systems: your inner ear, your middle ear, and your inner ear. Your outer ear is your earlobe or your pinnae. This is what's responsible for gathering sound waves. Mammals tend to have these big ones. And anyways, they just focus sound, airborne sound, into your ear canal, or part of your middle ear. Your middle ear includes your ear canal, your eardrum, and these three bones that vibrate in response to sound waves. Essentially, sound comes through here, hits this eardrum, and this eardrum is what is doing the impedance matching. So your inner ear has liquid. When sound travels through here, your eardrum vibrates, and these three little inner ear ossicles essentially act like a drum, and they hit your inner ear and they displace the liquid that way. In fish, you don't need this system because water is traveling through here, hitting water and displacing it already. But essentially, you have a sort of drum setup in your inner ear, and this setup is unique to mammals, specifically the incus and malleus bones. So reptiles, they hear with one bone, the stapes, we have that, but mammals have incorporated two jaw bones into their ear. That might sound weird, but if you think about where your jaw articulates with, it's right at your eardrum. So that's your middle ear. And your inner ear is composed of your semicircular canals and your cochlea. Essentially, your inner ear has two very important functions. One is the directionality of hearing. This cochlea can hear and interpret different sound frequencies, specifically higher frequency sounds. That's unique to mammals. But the semicircular canals are more importantly used in balance. You know you're upside down or if your head's side to side because of these semicircular canals in three different planes of gravity. So just like the three dimensions that we're walking around with, we have three that can tell us if we're upside down, if we're moving fast or not. So that's the inner ear. And again, it's just this sort of this organization of tubes with liquid moving in it that can tell you where sound's coming from and how fast in what direction you're going, which is both are very important for navigating on land. You might have seen this meme before. So I had this here. The snail in your ear, like these memes like to call it, is your cochlea. And again, that's unique to mammals. The cochlea is really important for hearing high frequency sounds, like, the cries of a baby, or, if you think of any mammal noise, like a squirrel or something, it's always high pitched. Whereas reptiles, except for birds, and a lot of primitive tetrapods like fish and amphibians, they can hear low vibration stuff, like, very deep noises, but high frequency sounds are harder to interpret. And mammals have a cochlea that can interpret that. But what about other tetrapods? That was mammal hearing. So reptiles are amniotkins. They have largely the same setup. They have an external ear. It's not developed into a pinnae like in mammals, but sound goes through here and it directs sound through their ear too. And like I mentioned before, mammals have three ear ossicles or three bones in their ear. Reptiles just have the stapes. In mammals, these two bones, the incus and malleus, which I think are actually these two, were once the quadrate and the articular bone in our evolution. And essentially they just became reduced. They became more and more reduced and eventually were incorporated into the ear. But that is a complicated story that I won't go into. On the other hand, amphibians ancestrally lack an eardrum or a tympanum. Frogs independently evolved it, but taxa like salamanders or caecilians, they completely lack an external eardrum. So not very good at hearing on land despite being tetrapods. Frogs, probably because they vocalize so much, do have a tympanum or an eardrum, but unfortunately it's entirely within their flesh and their soft tissue, so you can't really see it looking at their bones. So again, the setup is Amniotes, or mammals and reptiles, are a lot better at hearing on land than amphibians tend to be. So there's that. To make matters worse, the amphibians that don't have a tympanum or an eardrum, so caecilians and salamanders, they primarily hear through the ground. So they have a stapes like us and reptiles, or an ear bone, but it's actually connected from their ear along a muscle to their shoulder girdle. So they actually primarily hear very low frequency sound through the ground. So if I'm screaming at you, you can actually sense that through the ground if you have this sort of setup. And this is the primitive condition. It's not very good for directionality, but it will inform them like, hey, something's close to me or whatever. And this is the assumed early tetrapod condition, right? Hearing through the ground, lacking specialized hearing. But you're a paleontologist. How can you even find terrestrial hearing? How can you find evidence for terrestrial hearing in the fossil record? And thankfully, in reptiles especially, the eardrum is often formed by bones on the external surface of the skull. So this little conch here, seeing this turtle and this lizard, outs that eardrum that you saw in that reptile picture earlier. And this is actually the case for a lot of early tetrapods and a lot of early amniotes. If there's a eardrum, it's usually housed within some of these bones on the side of the skull. Like I mentioned, if you're wanting to study the origins of hearing in frogs, you're out of luck because it's just made out of the skin. But thankfully, we can look at the eardrum in the fossil record, which again, this is what I do. Furthermore, that one bone that is shared between mammals and reptiles and amphibians for hearing, the stapes, it's fairly robust in early tetrapods. So the stapes, again, responds to sound stimuli. Smaller stapes, a lighter stapes, can respond to higher frequency sounds, but a big, fat, robust stapes, like in these early tetrapods, the stapes is like this green bone or gray bone here, isn't going to be very sensitive to sound. But in early tetrapods, the stapes is so fat and connected to the side of the skull, and it's not a free element. It's actually probably used for supporting like the brain. But at some point in amniote evolution, the stapes get smaller and smaller. The stapes in your ear is smaller than a fingernail. But the freeing of the stapes from like the side of the skull is a major point in the evolution of tetrapod hearing. But the crux of it, fat stapes, you're not hearing well. Small light stapes, you're hearing well. So not only do we have the tympanum that we can look at, we also have the stapes. Like I mentioned, a light stapes can hear higher frequency sound. So here's some modern lizards, and you can kind of see that the stapes is really small, really gracile, and it has two components here. This was just to show you how thin they can get. In early tetrapods, or the first animals on land, stapes really fat, bigger than the brain in a lot of cases. But in lizards, and reptiles, and mammals today, stapes is very reduced. Thankfully, too, that inner ear system is often preserved within several bones inside the brain case. So here's actually, this is a marine crocodilian called a Plagiosaurus. But you can actually CT scan a fossil skull, which I do, you'll see in the next few slides. And you can actually see the morphology of the semicircular canal. You can see that reptiles have this thing called a cochlear duct, but it's not that like snail thing that mammals have. But the development of this inner ear can also tell you if something is particularly sensitive to sound. Mammals have like really tall canals in that cochlea, sensitive to sound. Reptiles have this big laguna or cochlea, so they're more sensitive to sound than like early tetrapod is. But in early tetrapods, this is largely a big fat mess that's not particularly well at hearing the directionality of hearing. Without getting into like the biomechanics of this, the bigger your canals are, the more sensitive you are to directions, just because the liquid can travel more. And there's these little hair cells within your inner ear that can sense when movement is occurring. So the bigger it is, the more sensitive it is to sound. So again, thankfully, many of these components are preserved within bones that you can actually find. Otherwise, I'd be out of luck. So actually, regarding the CT scanning specimens, here's one of the specimens part of my dissertation. It's a taxon called Milleropsis. It's like 260 million years old. We scanned the skull. The skull is 2 centimeters in length, but it's like that big. And but we stand it at the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility. So essentially neutrons are shot at this little tiny fossil, and you're able to get resolution, 1,000 times stronger than like a hospital X-ray. You would die if this process happened to you. But thankfully, you can scan really tiny things and see really tiny internal aspects of their anatomy, including their inner ear. So here's just this inner ear of Milleropsis, just to show you that you can actually segment this out in early reptiles. And let's see, how am I doing on time? Pretty good. So I guess the question is, and this was me kind of winnowing out of time, I was going to go into like the whole like tetrapodomorph transition. There's way too much to go over, but I'm going to put this in layman's terms. So when did hearing or terrestrial hearing evolve in tetrapods? Well, early tetrapods, including this is an early reptile called Captorinus. There's no tympanum on the side of the skull. You can see there's not that haunch that you saw in those reptiles. And the stapes is this really fat bone, similar to the size of the rest of the brain case. So this stapes is attached to the skull here. It's not moving in response to sound. So if it has a big stapes and no tympanum, it's probably not hearing well. And that's sort of the condition you see in most tetrapodomorphs. Weirdly enough, the tympanum doesn't show up in any tetrapod group, or at least a definitive tympanum that we can see. There's a chance that all these guys have like the frog tympanum that's in the skin. We'll just never know. But a definitive tympanum doesn't show up until around 100 million years after tetrapodomorphs were taking their first steps on land. So synapsids or mammal ancestors, like I mentioned, they're this articular bone, which will become part of your ear. Mammals start hearing with this like tympanum on their lower jaw. And if you look at mammals through time, you're going to see that these bones get more and more and more reduced until eventually they just pop up in your ear. But you don't see this until around 270 million years, which is a long time, a big lag between the first, animals with limbs and the first adaptations to hearing. Reptiles, similarly, around the same time, independently, seem to get a tympanum on the side of the skull, just like you saw in those reptiles earlier, here and here. And there's actually a lot of tympanums in the fossil record. I'll show you some that I'm working on too. Here's a scan of something that I did called Milleretta. You're not going to be able to see it because it's spinning around, but on the bottom right, there's a tympanum on its squamosal and quadratical bones. I don't expect you guys to see it because it's tiny, but there's this little like hole, little margination on the back of the skull that would have housed a soft tissue membrane. And the cool thing about this is it's unreported so far. So earliest years, no one's ever looked at them, probably because it's really small in these animals. Here's another Milleretta. You might be able to catch the tympanum right here if you look really quick, but you can trust me and just believe me that it's there. But what's cool is what about the middle Permian is making reptiles and mammals seemingly independently evolve a tympanum? Is it predator-prey interactions? Is it something about the environment? Or is it a gap in the fossil record? Maybe there are tympanums that go further back in amniote evolution, we just don't have them yet, which might be the more likely scenario instead of trying to postulate as to why they convergently got it. Now, I think 30 minutes, so I'm at 23. But so this is the crux of what to remember about this talk. I talked to you guys a lot about random stuff, but mostly this is how you hear terrestrially, okay? You need a stapes or an ear bone that is light and can respond to sound stimuli, because a fat ear bone isn't going to vibrate to sound. You need to have an external eardrum, like ours, or like a lizard's, that can gather sound. And you need to have an inner ear that is capable of processing a wide range of sound frequencies. Let's see. And back to that question, why was there a 100 million year gap? We won't really know unless we find fossils that are a little older than the stuff I'm working on now. Painfully, there is a gap in amniote fossils, so like earliest reptiles and earliest mammals. It's called Olson's gap, between like 285 and like 275. So before that, there's no ear. After the 10 million years later, there's ears. Presumably somewhere in between the ear showed up, but we don't really know when unless we get lucky and find something in between. But yeah, I shaved around 8 minutes off this. I had a lot more slides on just, random amphibian brains, but I figured I'd spare you it. But yeah, so that is kind of the evolution of tetrapod hearing. For some reason, there's a 100 million year gap between legs and then hearing on land. You tell me why. But yeah, I can take any questions, but hopefully that was it was both painful, but also you can relish in the fact that you probably won't be quizzed on this. So anyways, I open to any questions. We have some CPI positions in the museum to work on further scans like this if you wanted to. We also have positions to work with me and Brandon and get credit for doing your own research on scans like these ones. So pretty nifty. Yeah. Any questions, guys?
So how long have you been working on this research?
So I'm on my third year here. My first year, when I got started here, I was supposed to do like locomotion. I was supposed to look at locomotion in a group of reptiles called archosaurs in the Triassic. COVID happened. I got bored. I sent a few emails to people saying like, hey, do you have any pictures of like the bones of these milleretids? Not because I wanted their skulls, but I just wanted to see what they're very average looking. And average looking fossils mean they're probably a good representation of what like an animal looked like at the time, like compared to like a turtle that has like a heavily modified shell. This thing kind of looks like a lizard. And I was just like, hey, like, what does it look like? I was bored, curiosity, and they're like, here's 3 scans of them. Do what you will. And now I work on early reptile and early amnio evolution. But these scans 2 years. So I kind of had a year of just like messing around. And now I've had several undergrads come work with me, Maya, Savannah, help me out. So I've done these milleretiid skulls. Savannah's working on some weird 300 million-year-old noodle reptile thingies. I've really reduced limbs and something called an oenetid, which is like a milleretiid but with a bigger ear. But yeah, we have a lot of other scans coming. Probably too much for me to work on. But yeah, so 2 years. Anything else before I hand over this to Henry for pterosaurs?
I mean, Brandon did suggest having a break, having like a 5-minute.
Oh, 5-minute break. Awesome. So we are going to have a break. Let's give you how long does this run to, this lab?
Like 4.
Fourth. Okay.
You guys are definitely getting out early.
We'll get 6. We'll do a break till what? 35, like an 8-minute
Yeah, that
break.
works.
Yeah, 8-minute break, and then he'll give you an equivalent spiel about random things. And then
Excellent. I have
guys
to,
go.
I'm gonna freeze it right there. I'm gonna make a couple last minute tweaks. On it. I'll just close that. There's just how it be. That just how it be sometimes.
First, I took the picture of it. I was like, I have an hour to do this.
That's why. I don't have any. No, I don't. I think it's just. Yeah. Okay, see.
But I'm like, no, I turned it in. Oh, you're freaking nice. Probably. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, but because.
Just waiting for it to hit 135.
It's a lot of big words.
I'll wait till we hit 135.
No. Right.
They never got like.
But I thought you. Looking, reading on the. Closer to the elevation. Because that's where. It's like. Just as the
Yes, I mean.
Yeah. Part of why it's. It's silly because I last had your. I'm done. I'm just. Waiting here. I gotta get my phone, but now my. Might. Because you don't go to this, like, for them, you don't need to like check.
Right. All right, so it is 1:35. So now Xavier just talked to you for 25 minutes about some random crap. So I'm going to talk to you for maybe a little bit longer than that about some random crap. So my name is Henry. I am a master's student in Brandon's lab, and today I'm going to talk about what prehistoric flying reptiles ate and how can we tell this. So if you aren't familiar with pterosaurs, they are a clade of flying reptiles that evolved in the mid-Triassic about 225 million years ago and went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous 66 million years ago. They're not dinosaurs, but they are closely related. And therefore, and thus not being dinosaurs also means that they have pretty much no bearing on the evolution of birds. They are a completely independent appearance of flight in the fossil record. And so unlike bird wings, the pterosaur wing consists of a membrane of skin and very thin muscle that's stretched out from the edge of the wing finger, connecting all the way down to the ankles, similar to what's present in modern bats. So the pterosaur wing was constructed like this. Here's the humerus, radius, and ulna here. The wrist was elongated in most of them, and then the first three fingers were these little were relatively small and used to support it while on land, while the fourth finger was extremely thick. The first phalanx of the fourth finger is as thick around as the ulna and extremely elongate to support the wing membrane. Kind of similar to the wing configuration of bats, except instead of 4 fingers supporting the membrane, pterosaurs only had 1. Pterosaurs are interesting for many reasons. One of which is their foraging ecology. So pterosaurs filled a lot of niches that in the Cenozoic are filled by birds, as well as filling some niches that have yet to be filled by birds. So the question of what pterosaurs ate it's still being studied. It's a very interesting question. And so in order to determine what pterosaurs ate and how, actually just look at all these skull morphologies. So this is pretty much the diversity of skull morphologies that you see across pterosaurs. There had to be some variation in here. These guys were clearly not all eating the same thing. So there are 6 ways to tell what pterosaurs ate and how. The first and most obvious is direct preservation of foodstuffs. You can look at coprolites, fossilized dung. You can look at feeding traces preserved in sediment. You can look at wear patterns on teeth. You can look at isotope ratios, and you could just look at comparative anatomy. And we're going to go over all of these. So the most objective record of what pterosaurs ate is gut contents, i.e. the pterosaur ate something, died, and was fossilized with that thing still in his gut. So far, only 2 pterosaur species are known to have had gut contents. Multiple specimens of Rhamphorhynchus have been found with bones and scales of fish in the gut region, and at least 2 specimens of Huatia draco preserve seeds in the gut cavity. There's also a couple pterosaur specimens which preserve fish scales or bones right around the mouth, either just outside, as in this Scaphognathus, or at the base of the lower jaw in this Pteranodon. And so these have been interpreted as regurgitate. i.e. the pterosaur died and vomited up the last thing that it ate. This happens with dead animals sometimes. I've personally experienced it with a dying seagull. So we can infer that both of these guys were eating fish based off of this. Now there's this other fossil that is extremely interesting. This is the impression of a fossil cephalopod. Notice anything weird about it? Yes, there's a tooth. So this is the tooth of Rhamphorhynchus, which, as shown earlier, has preserved fish in its gut. Evidently, a Rhamphorhynchus tried to bite this fossil cephalopod, and it got away. So this demonstrates that Rhamphorhynchus was preying on both fish and cephalopods. Here's what it would look like in life. You can see all the snaggly teeth going along its jaw. And of course, after the gut, it has to come out somewhere. Very few pterosaur coprolites have been identified, but here's one of them. It's relatively small. It's about this big. It's from early Cretaceous of. It's from the early Cretaceous of France. And inside this coprolite, they found small invertebrates, small floating invertebrates that would have lived in shallow water. We know this is a pterosaur coprolite because it was found in the middle of a bunch of pterosaur trackways. And these tracks have been attributed to the family Ctenocosmatidae. So Ctenocosmatids are a clade of pterosaurs that have lots and lots of teeth. These teeth are needle-like, straight, they're closely compressed. They line the entire jaws. Some of them have this sort of flatter, expanded area on the front of their snout. And this one, Pterodaustro, has literally 1,000 teeth, which run down the entire lower jaw, forming this baleen-like structure. And what do you think this might have been used for? Any guesses?
Capturing prey.
Correct. Specifically through filter feeding. So we see very similar structures to Ctenocosmatid teeth in the jaws of flamingos and spoonbills, both of which are filter feeding birds. They wade in shallow water and they filter small invertebrates from the water. So based on the coprolites and that comparative anatomy, we're able to infer that Ctenocosmatids were similarly filter feeders, lived in shallow waters and filtered for small invertebrates. This also lines up with some trace fossils that we found associated with pterosaur trackways. These are pterosaur footprints, and all these little pock marks and sort of scrapes in the sediment have been interpreted as possible feeding traces, i.e. the pterosaur was possibly probing around in the mud looking for something to eat. There's also this really interesting study that came out a few years ago, which looked at wear patterns on the teeth. So first they looked at how wear patterns in the teeth of modern reptiles and bats lined up with diet. And so they were able to identify, for example, this micro wear patterns that look like this indicate piscivory, fish eating. Stronger wear patterns like this indicate that you're eating sort of hard-shelled animals like mollusks, etc. So they got this baseline of wear patterns in modern reptiles and bats, lined that up with diet, and then looked at the wear patterns in pterosaur teeth to line them up. And so they're able to determine quite a few pterosaur diets from this. I'm not going to go through each one of these individually. Just know that this is a thing that happened and it's pretty cool. Similarly, there have been a couple of studies which looked at delta carbon-13 values in pterosaur teeth. And so delta carbon-13 values can help differentiate whether or not the pterosaur was eating terrestrial or aquatic prey, because the ratio of proportions of carbon-13 in seawater is going to be different than what you're going to find in terrestrial systems. And so these studies determined that in the case of some closely related pterosaurs, like for example, these two, this is Onhanguera, the isotope ratios indicate that Onhanguera was eating a lot of aquatic prey, whereas the closely related Coluborhynchus was eating more terrestrial prey. Its delta carbon-13 values were more similar to those of predatory dinosaurs. So going to show that even among closely related pterosaurs, diets could differ. And for the record, the dental microware study also found the same result. Anhangara was fish eating, Colborhynchus was carnivorous. And when all those fail, we have to turn back to comparative anatomy, looking at the anatomy of the jaws, the teeth, the lack of teeth, as the case may be, comparing those to modern mammals, birds, reptiles, even fish in some instances, and trying to infer what their diet could have been from that. And this is crucial for these pterosaurs on this bottom row. Notice anything about them? They do not have teeth, correct. So these are all members of the clade Azhdarchoidea, which is entirely toothless. It evolved at the very beginning of the Cretaceous, and by the end of the Cretaceous was the most diverse and widespread pterosaur clade on the planet. And so 5 major clades are recognized. You have Chilianopterids and Elonchids, both of which have sort of generalized morphologies. Tapejarids, which have short snouts and these really tall and these really huge crests on their heads, and many times larger than the rest of the skull, sometimes larger than the entire torso. You have Thalassodromids, which have less shortened snouts, these big robust skulls, and once again, huge head crests. And Azhdarchids, which generally have very long necks. Azhdarchids are really interesting because some of them had wingspans of over 10 meters. These were the largest flying animals that ever evolved. These were the size of small aircraft. On the ground, they would have stood as tall as a giraffe. I've seen this model in person. It is horrifying. So Azhdarchids are really cool. Now, nothing that big that flies is around today. So ever since the first giant Azhdarchids were found in 1975, people have asked, what were they doing, effectively? And so the major hypotheses that have been proposed are effectively fish eating, scavenging, and hunting terrestrial prey. So how can we determine what these pterosaurs were eating and how? So let's go back to the methods we discussed earlier. Only 2 Azhdarchoid fossils have been found with gut contents. Both of them are Huashiadraco, which is a tapejarid. We haven't found any coprolites or feeding traces yet, and dental microware and isotope work is impossible because these guys have no teeth. So we are forced to look at their morphology and try to infer their ecology from there. So first, let's look at the average Azhdarchoid body plan as helpfully modeled by a Chilianopterid right here. What can you guys notice about it? Yep.
The mouth, beak area is very large compared to the body.
Yep, very large head relative to very large beak relative to the body size. Anything else?
Long necks.
Yep, long necks. Anything else?
Relatively small body.
Yes, the torso of derived pterosaurs was quite small relative to the rest of the body. Very good, very good. So, the general Azhdarchoid gestalt had a large toothless skull, long necks, short torsos, a very short tail, which might not have even been visible in life with all the meat on the leg muscles. The limbs were long, but the wing finger was relatively short, and the feet were flat. And so we're going to focus on these 4 in particular right now. So the average Azhdarchoid neck vertebrae would have looked kind of like this. These are the cervical vertebrae of a Chilianopterid. These are considered moderately elongated by pterosaur standards. There are only 9 bones in the entire neck. So if you had to lengthen the neck, you have to lengthen each individual bone in the neck. This is also a problem faced by giraffes, which also have quite long neck vertebrae because they only have to stretch out 7 to fill the entire neck. Of course, there's variation. Thalassodromids, big robust skulls, big head crests, they have these shorter, more robust and blockier neck vertebrae. And Azhdarchids go in the completely opposite direction. So the neck vertebrae, so Azhdarchids have really long necks. So the neck vertebrae are therefore also extremely elongate. The most elongate neck vertebrae are over 15 times as long as they are wide. That is insane. So here's what an Azhdarchid neck would have looked like if you put all the bones together. You might notice that basically as you go towards the center of the neck, each vertebra gets longer, with the longest bone and then with the longest one, the neck being the fifth cervical. And so as you elongate, and so as you get longer, you get more slender. Now I'll note that not every Azhdarchid is built equally. There are 4 rough morphotypes of cervical vertebrae in Azhdarchids. They're sort of like moderately elongate, they're sort of like average elongate ones, which have these sort of pinched sides so that when you get towards the center of the vertebrae, you get to the narrowest point. You have ones which are similar, but they do not have pinched sides, so you do not get any narrowing. You have these really long ones with the pinching all the way in the back here. These are the most elongated of the bunch. And for a couple of them, you get vertebrae that are secondarily shorter. So these would have evolved from long-necked ancestors that then evolved shorter necks. Now, how could this be? And what could the adaptive value of each cervical vertebra morphotype be? i.e., how might these shapes affect life? So each morphology of neck vertebra would have resulted in different lengths of necks. For example, these two are both in that giant 10-meter category, but Aurumbrigionia had far more elongate and slender vertebrae than Hatzegopteryx, represented by this blocky one, would have. And preliminary biomechanical calculations suggest that the shorter, blockier vertebrae are stronger and more resistant to bending forces than the slender and elongate ones. I will note, however, that this is effectively preliminary, only been done for these two, hasn't been looked at in depth yet. But this goes to show that the more robust neck vertebrae translates to a stronger neck. Moving on to the limbs. Azhdarchoids have relatively short wing fingers, which have led to a low aspect ratio. You know, the wings have been sort of like shorter and broader relative to the body. And so if you compare the aspect ratio of Azhdarchoid wings to modern birds, they tend to plot around here, close to thermal soarers. Now, a good example of this among modern birds would be condors. And so condors are basically adapted to glide for long distances, spending very little energy to travel far, which is useful for a scavenging animal. And it's thought that Azhdarchoids, and especially Azhdarchids, would have also been able to glide for long distances without expending much energy. In fact, it's been proposed that they could have potentially crossed oceans this way, the giant ones, because there would have been enough fat on the body to support gliding across the entire Atlantic in one go. That is wild. I will note that the study this plot came from only looked at Azhdarchids, but if you plot other Azhdarchoids on this diagram, they don't end up very far. They'd end up in this area, which is around where you would find other terrestrial birds, for example, parrots, or even things like chickens, which are not very good, which are quote unquote poor flyers. So their wing aspect to loading ratios plot with terrestrial birds. The limbs of Azhdarchoids were pretty long on the ground. All pterosaurs have very long arms to help support the wing, but most pterosaurs have short legs, which would have led to sort of this more awkward-looking posture on the ground. In contrast, Azhdarchoids had more equal forelimb to hind limb length ratios, which would have led to a sort of more balanced look on the ground. Now, does this remind you of anything? Are there any animals around today that this sort of looks like?
Brad?
Yes, yes. So the two comparisons that I have on the slides are long-legged, long-necked birds and hoofed mammals, which include giraffes, but also things like Geryonyx, like this one right here. The limb proportions of Azhdarchoids are pretty close to those that we see in some hoofed mammals, for example, giraffes. Based on this, hoofed mammals get around on the ground very easily. They are pretty agile and swift, as the case may be in some instances. So it's thought that the Azhdarchoids, and especially Azhdarchids, were also as good on the ground. And this is also borne out if you look at their feet. So here's a bunch of pterosaur feet. The two Azhdarchoids are circled in red. And so you might notice that the pterosaur foot has 4 toes in most of these. There's a 5th toe here, which is lost in these guys. And the 4 toes in the Azhdarchoids are bound together by skin up until the very end, where you have the claws coming in. This is actually a very similar construction to the human foot. And so human feet are good at walking long distances at a moderate speed. And so based on that, we can infer that Azhdarchoids probably walked similarly. And this is borne out by trackways. We found trackways of Azhdarchids with this characteristic foot morphology that actually looks a lot like a human print. And they're walking along on the ground. So taking the limb proportions and foot morphology, we can infer that Azhdarchoids were good on the ground, were well adept on the ground, possibly even more comfortable walking around on the ground than flying, as is the case for some birds. I will note that Tapejards, short beaks, big crests, they have these huge curved claws on their feet. Like only half of this is the actual bony claw. The rest of this is the keratin sheath covering the claw. Keep in mind when you're looking at any fossil claw, it would have been extended much longer than what's actually fossilized by the keratinous covering. So these guys had huge, horrifyingly curved claws. What might these have been used for? Any ideas? Big, sharp, curved claws. That's an idea. Yep, so they actually tested this, plotting the inner curvature of claws of Tapejards, as well as a normal Azhdarchoid represented by Geodopterus, against modern animals, modern birds and mammals. And they found that that claws with this degree of curvature are found not only in predators, but also in animals that live in trees. And these claws were on the human-like feet, probably not being used to kill things. Instead, the authors of the study concluded that Tapejard claws were more comparable to those of tree-living animals, like, for example, squirrels. Now, you don't really think of the claws of squirrels as being sort of big and curved, but they actually are if you look at them closely. So it's thought that Tapejards might have been arboreal, living in trees. So, with all that taken into account, what type of lifestyle is most likely for Azhdarchoids? Well, there's actually a name for it: terrestrial stalking. So the general idea is that Azhdarchoids would have fed on the ground while walking around on the ground. The long limbs and neck would have given them a vantage point from which they could see small prey on the ground. And then they would have basically just plucked it up from above and swallowed it whole. And so if it works, I got a video of what it would look like in action, assuming that PowerPoint, oh, yay, there we go. There should be audio, but there isn't. Hold on. Hold on. Let me see if that works. That's from the show Prehistoric Planet, which is the legitimately the best dinosaur show ever made. 10 out of 10 would recommend. So it may look far-fetched, but it actually isn't. There are plenty of modern birds that have similar lifestyles, namely storks, cranes, herons, ground hornbills. It's also been observed in shoebills, bustards, and caracaras. And they all have a sort of similar long-legged, long-necked, long-beaked body plan to Darkoids. And I'd like to note that there is quite a bit of dietary variability among these terrestrially stalking birds. So cranes, for example, are generalist omnivores. They're going to eat both plant matter and small animals, the proportion of which varies by species, age, habitat, season, etc. Ground hornbills are full-on carnivores. Their diet consists exclusively of small terrestrial animals. Storks, herons, and shoebills are mostly piscivorous. So you're going to see these guys foraging in shallow waters, eating lots of fish, but also amphibians, and they're not going to turn down small mammals. I've seen herons eating rabbits. It's horrifying. The open-bill stork is a shellfish specialist, so it has this weirdly curved beak, which it uses to help pry open shells of mollusks that live in shallow water. Marabou storks and adjutants are scavengers. A large proportion of their diet is made up of dead carcasses and garbage. And Abdim stork's diet consists largely of insects like locusts, grasshoppers, and caterpillars. It is the smallest stork species still around. Now, would we expect this variation in diet to be present in Darkoids? Well, with all this diversity in beak shape, yes, we would. So there's a lot of variability in the Darkoids that we have skull material from in how long or short the beak was, how deep or shallow it was, whether it curved upwards or downwards, how wide it expanded, etc. And so there's a lot, and so clearly they were filling quite a few niches. And I also like to note that these skulls range in size from being about this big to longer than I am tall. So can we tell from morphology what exactly these guys are eating? In many cases, no. The comparative work has not been really done with birds yet to really align beak morphology with diet, and we would need to do that in order to compare with pterosaurs. But there are a few Darkoid groups in which we can make more narrow inferences than just terrestrial stalking. The smallest Darkoids were quite little. The smallest that we know about is pretty much the same size as a cat. It's this cute little guy. It's likely that these guys were more insectivorous, like Abdim stork, as well as small species of bustard, going after larger insects over things like reptiles and small mammals. The giant Darkids, the ones with 10-meter wingspans, are pretty much universally considered macro predators. These guys would have been eating pretty good-sized terrestrial animals. For example, small dinosaurs. There's really nothing that fills this niche alive today. Nothing this big that eats prey of this size. I'd also like to focus on this one, Hatzegopteryx. So if you may remember, Hatzegopteryx had the really chunky, robust neck vertebrae, shorter, stronger neck. We only have a few fragments of its skull, but these hint at a sort of wide maw, this weird downturned snout with this chin of this basically ventral extension of the mandible that possibly helped strengthen it. And the bone walls of Hatzegopteryx are 3 times as thick as in other pterosaurs. So this suggests that Hatzegopteryx specifically was going after larger prey than other giants. This skull would have been longer than I am tall. This thing would have been able to eat a person whole. It is terrifying. I promise we're nearing the end of the presentation. So Elonchids, they have these ridges on their beaks. So the lower beak had these paired ridges about halfway back, and the upper beak had one in the midline that fit in between them. And so it's been proposed that these could have been like open-bill storks and oyster catchers used to process shellfish that lived in shallow waters. Considering that Elonchids are found mostly in sort of tidal estuarine habitats, this seems pretty likely. There's also this weird elongate that's very small. It has this really long beak that doesn't taper with little sensory pits going all the way down. This is basically the same as what we see in modern birds like sandpipers, which probe for food on muddy shores. And so it's likely that Leptostomia did the same thing. And then tapijards, short beaks, big crests, they seem to have been doing their own thing. So these beaks are down curved, very short, pretty deep. They're pretty wide as well. They have these bumps on the sides of the jaw, almost like teeth, which sort of fit into this notch on the upper jaw. Now, these skulls are surprisingly similar to skulls of parrots. And so you can see parrots, they also have wide skulls, short, relatively deep, down curved beaks. You got these sort of bumps that fit into notches on the lower jaw. Parrots are mostly herbivores. They're going to be eating fruits, seeds, other plant matter, etc. And so it's thought that tapijards probably lived similarly. They were omnivores and had a lot of plants in their diet, as directly supported by the seeds we found in their guts. And combining this with the big claws of a tree-living animal, it's something these guys were basically filling the same niche that parrots and toucans do today. And then Thalassodromeus, this big dude, that is close to life size, actually, on that screen. Its skull is quite robust. It has this downturned snout. The lower jaw is basically extended into this blade-like keel of bone. Modeling on the skull suggests that it had very high bite forces, and as discussed earlier, the neck vertebrae would have been short and boxy, indicating a strong neck. And so we aren't really sure exactly what it's doing, but there are two major hypotheses in the running. Well, when it was first described, its skull was compared to the skimmer, which is a modern bird that basically hunts for fish by doing this. It sticks its lower jaw in the water and flies along, and if it hits something, it snaps up a fish. This has been proposed for Thalassodromeus because that big bony keel looks a lot like the bony keel on the jaw of the skimmer. However, the skimmer has a suite of adaptations in the back of the skull that help withstand the force of running its lower jaw along the water. Thalassodromeus doesn't have this. If it tried to skim, its jaw would break. So the two hypotheses that are currently running are either it was another terrestrial predator and used its high bite forces to kill things and its robust neck to deal with the struggles of prey, or it was another wader that fed on mollusks using the high bite forces to crush their shells. This is still an area of active study. We don't have a solid answer for this guy yet. So I talked about a lot, but the main takeaways. As darkoid pterosaurs, they were adept on the ground. They probably foraged terrestrially. There's a wide variety of skull morphologies, which probably correlate at least some of the time with dietary diversity. So we would expect to see a lot of terrestrial stalking in this clade, which, like modern birds, you would see variation on this model in specialized clades. And I just think that they're really cool animals to study. So that's that. Does anyone have any questions? Yep.
How do the bones of pterosaurs compare to that of birds? Are they hollow or?
Yep. Just like the bones of birds, pterosaur bones were hollow with really thin bone walls and narrow internal struts that help strengthen the bone while also keeping it lightweight, just like birds.
Go back to the previous step. Thank you.
Yep.
The pterosaurs that have large crest, would that cause an imbalance, like when they fly?
That's actually been modeled, and so in most cases the crests were extremely narrow. Like if you looked at them head on, it would just look like a straight line. In the end, that wouldn't have added a whole lot of weight to the animal, and there's aerodynamic studies currently going on how this would have affected flight. So we'll see.
Do those crests have any, like, is there any theory for their being there other than like display structure?
display structures are the main hypothesis for why they're around. So if you look at different species of tapejarid, they all have differently shaped crests. And so, for example, this one is this sort of low rounded crest. This one is this huge shark fin shaped crest. This one is these two bony spurs, which would have been filled in by soft tissue, etc. A type of structure like this, which varies this widely among closely related species, is likely going to be a display structure.
So can we say it could be for muscle attachment, but it would be weird because they have no teeth.
Yeah, most of the jaw muscles would have attached on this lower part of the back of the skull over here. The crest again would have had pretty much no muscle attachment at all. We've actually found fossils that preserve the soft tissue, and it's pretty much just a sheet of soft tissue, no muscle in there at all. So most likely display structures.
Do the females have them as well, that they're found?
Evidently, yes. We haven't found any individuals that lack these crests, although these two on the top are actually from the same species. And you can see that one is a heck of a lot larger than the other. So this could be sexual dimorphism, could be age, could be individual variation. We don't know for sure.
This is a long shot, because do those soft fossil preservations have any indication of blood vessels that could be also heat temperature regulation?
That's been suggested. However, every indicator suggests that pterosaurs were completely warm-blooded to the same degree as birds, so that wouldn't be necessary. All right, so if that's that, then thank you for letting me ramble on for half an hour about this. I'm gonna stop the share and let me